When I was 18 years old, I moved to Oklahoma City for the first time. I knew about the Oklahoma City bombing, but really not much else when I first arrived. On the way to my first visit, I would listen to podcasts of snickering men discussing how convenient it was that the culprit was already in jail when they were finally able to identify him as the terrorist. Now, I had always thought that the city had a brutalist aesthetic, because with going to somewhere new, it's important to me to relate my completely unfamiliar surroundings with an architectural movement or a television show. It helps a great deal in relaxing me. My very first obsession was with the deadliest domestic terrorist act in the history of the U.S., the Oklahoma City bombing. I found many times I was met with forces that guided me towards the catastrophic event. The Oklahoma City bombing was an act of domestic terrorism done by a man who was radicalized by, amongst other things, the events in Waco, Texas, and Ruby Ridge a few years prior to the attack. He believed that the government had no right to infringe upon personal liberties, and that intervening between a cult and their God-given right to act cultishly was treasonous to the founding fathers of their beautiful country. I would listen to anything I could find on the bomber McVeigh. Groups of 4 men talking about his influence on modern culture. Groups of 2 men talking about how lucky it was that he was already arrested for a trivial traffic violation when it was discovered that he was the culprit. Sometimes a single man in his bedroom, his microphone cutting out, his mother shouting at him from the other room to come for dinner. And this is actually how I found out about Salisbury steaks, another obsession to come later on in my life. I moved to a neighborhood called Bricktown, another reinforcement of my belief in the architectural influence in the city. I didn't understand brutalism, and I probably still don't. After dumping a few suitcases from my U-Haul into the foyer of the mid-century house I was renting, I decided to take a stroll around the neighborhood. Walking has always been an important sensation for me when familiarizing myself with a new environment. In fact, days earlier, my move took my U-Haul and I through the Sierra Nevada mountains, where I encountered a freak summer snowstorm. When reaching a mountain summit nearby Lake Tahoe, a sudden realization of the unknown befell me. A panic rose like a stink from my feet. I needed to bury my toes in the ground my car's toes were burying themselves into. So I decided to slip into an icy snowbank beside the 2-lane mountain road in hopes of taking a stroll and extinguishing my fear. Later, as the sheriff attached his tow hook on the front of my car, my ring toe, fourth from my big toe, purple with frostbite, I wondered if perhaps I gave too much of myself to my obsessions. On my first stroll in my new neighborhood, I passed a store that seemed to be the size of a jail cell, with one small door and bright metal machines lining the left and right walls. Above the entrance glowed a bright neon light that read, Huan Zhao Laundromat, and in smaller text below, open 9 hours, ! I found myself growing incredibly curious as to how the 9 hours of open time were allocated. Were they all at night? Did the store close sporadically throughout the day? Is this style of business sustainable for a mom-and-pop shop? Do shops need to be sustainable in Oklahoma City? What competition could there be for this location? Standing on the concrete sidewalk outside of the strip mall that held the store, I saw 2 figures jump like shadows from atop the machines on the right of the room to the machines on the left. With this movement came a powerful acidic smell. Something like someone had purchased a man-sized pestle and mortar and filled it with salt and vinegar potato chips and Newman's Own Italian dressing. My ears began to ring and my ring toe began to throb. Something it had begun to do since my trip to Lake Tahoe. My understanding of where the ground and the sky resided turned on an axis. The ground soon became angled at 38 degrees, requiring me to tilt my head to understand my physical presence in Bricktown, Oklahoma City. The neon light began to pulse and refract, and my body began to hum. I walked up to the front of the building and peered through the door. Inside, I saw 2 of the skinniest people I have ever seen. They wore incredibly thin, white, deep V-neck t-shirts, with shoes the brand of which I had never seen. For my physical tilt, it seemed that there was text in the shoe reading Vergin Jumpaz. I don't remember entering the store, but it seemed to me that suddenly I was surrounded by incandescent light. The acidic smell, the metal machines from all sides. And now that I understood that I had entered the laundromat, I realized that the shadows and figures had disappeared. There was silence. Not a single washing machine was in use. All that could be heard was a thick sloshing coming from behind a silver two-way door that barely stood in its frame at the far end of the room. Slosh, 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 gasp, moan. There was clearly someone struggling to move something viscous behind the door. I was overcome with spine-shuddering fear that reminded me that I had been constipated since beginning my journey to Oklahoma City. I knew I could not confront what lay behind the far door with my stomach in the state. I walked calmly, slowly, out of the storefront. This laundromat and its resident figures shaped the next 3 years of my life in Oklahoma City, and most likely every decision I was to make after I was forced to leave.